Oh, welcome to Module 5. Module 5, we are tackling a whole bunch of big, difficult, complicated issues. I'm really looking forward to seeing what you get out of them. So I don't talk forever at you. What are we dealing with this week? First of all, we are kind of in terms of placing yourself chronologically in this module. We are in the final throes of the Civil War. We are in 1864, 1865, as the war is grinding very slowly to an end. We are going to get a good feeling in the Susanna Ural book. Don't Hurry Me Down to Hades. We're going to get a good feeling in that for what that looks like, the death of the Confederacy, what that looks like, what that feels like, what the final year and a half, 18 months of the war is like for the Union Army, for the Union government and politicians. So we're going to be thinking about that. Then we're going to be taking sort of a hard left turn and looking west. And usually when Civil War historians talk about the West, they are talking about the Western theater, the war in, say, Tennessee, right? That's not what we're doing. We're looking really, really, really far west. We are looking at the deep Southwest, specifically in this particular article we're reading this week. We're looking at New Mexico. In the documentary we're watching for this week, we're looking at Minnesota. Or the Dakotas and Minnesota. And so that right there should raise a question for you, right? What do those states so far west have to do with the Civil War? Like those, in many cases, in all of these cases, I think in all, these aren't even states, right? They're territories. They're not even states in the Union yet. So that right there is something I want you to be grappling with. How do they fit in, right? How does the West fit into this conflict? The documentary that you're watching is about a particular event that takes place in Mankato, Minnesota in 1862. It might be 1863. Forgive me if I've gotten that year wrong. I think it's 1862, though. Against some members of the Lakota tribe. And this documentary is very, very powerful, but it also is not explicitly about the Civil War, right? The Civil War is happening in this event, is happening on the margins. And so again, one of the things I want you to be thinking about is, how does this connect? How does this reorient the way that we understand the Civil War? How do we fit this in to the Civil War era? The other thing that you have dealing with the West this week is an article by Megan Kate Nelson called Indians Make the Best Guerrillas. And this is talking about making a case for why the West should be integral to our understanding of the Civil War era, and how we should reorient our perspective of the Civil War to incorporate the West. Why it's important to include the West in that. And again, dealing with Native American involvement in the war. Then we're tackling a totally different topic, and another huge important topic. Lots of really big things this week. This other topic is Black Confederates, the potential for Black Confederates, the possibility of arming slaves to become Confederate soldiers, and tackling the mythology around Black Confederates. So first you have two primary documents. The first is Patrick Cleburne's proposal to arm slaves, a Confederate officer who is the first person to suggest that, hey, we're having a manpower shortage. Maybe we should arm slaves. And so you're reading that proposal, and I want you to get a feeling for what his argument is. Then, to pair with that, you have a letter that was sent from a Southern politician named named Howell Cobb to another man named James Seddon, the Secretary of War for the Confederacy. And in that article, he's specifically rebutting the argument of Patrick Cleburne. So comparing and contrasting, right? The big question that arises out of those two primary documents is, what is at stake? Why not arm slaves? Because the Confederacy is facing a huge manpower crisis. They do not have enough people to fight this war. What are they going to do? Well, they have this huge untapped source of manpower in their slaves, in their property that they could use, right? Why not use them? What's at stake there? That's the question I want you to be considering. The third, the essay that goes along with those two primary documents is called The Myth of the Black Confederate by a writer named Kevin Levin. And this is tackling a really persistent myth that exists about Black Confederate soldiers. Did Black Confederate soldiers exist? Did they fight willingly? Did they fight of their own free will? Did they have the choice to fight? How many of them really were there? But really the big question is, why is it so important to some people that there be Black Confederate soldiers? What does that mean? When Americans today look back at the Civil War and they try to argue, but there were Black Confederates. Why are they making that argument? What does that do for them? What does that do for the history of the Confederacy? So that's the question I want you to be thinking about in that section. The last thing that you have there are two very short articles, one about Sherman's march and the other about Lincoln's visit to Richmond, Virginia, the capital of the Confederacy, after the Confederacy has fallen. Or after Richmond has fallen. And in that, I want you to be thinking about the death of the Confederacy, how and why it dies. And I also want you to think about, in that last article about Lincoln's visit to Richmond, how he is thinking about Southerners. How he's thinking about how to bring these two worlds, these two competing countries back together after this intensely bitter conflict. How do we ever knit ourselves back into a nation again after this enormous bloodshed? And that's, of course, going to bring us into next week into Reconstruction and Civil War memory. Okay, I know that's a lot to take in, but it's going to make for some really fascinating conversations this week. I'm really looking forward to it. Of course, any questions at all, get me on Twitter, text me, email me, send me whatever messages on Blackboard. Can you do that? I don't know. And I'll see you in the blogs. All right. See ya.